How many people in your life know exactly how much you've sacrificed to stay out of a mess they made? How many of them have ever thanked you for it, or even admitted they knew? This is a story about a woman who spent 5 years being the most composed person in every room, protecting a family that had already decided her silence was something they were entitled to, until the most dangerous man in her professional life asked her one question, and she told him the truth. If this story reaches 200 likes, I'll know this one hit where it was supposed to. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. And if you haven't followed the channel yet, this is a good moment to do it. New stories go up regularly, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. The 43rd floor of the Caruso Group's Chicago Tower was the kind of place that made ordinary people stand up straighter without being told why. The floors were pale stone. The glass ran floor to ceiling. The furniture was dark and unadorned, chosen not for comfort, but for authority. And the silence there was a different kind of silence than the silence found in libraries or hospitals. It was the silence of a room where decisions were made that no one questioned twice. Nadia Voss had worked on that floor for 11 months. She had learned, in those 11 months, exactly how much space she was permitted to occupy. She arrived early. She left late. She dressed in clean lines and neutral colors. She kept her dark hair pulled back into something controlled and professional, though there were moments, brief, private moments, when she caught her own reflection in the elevator's mirrored doors and registered, with a quiet and complicated feeling, that the woman looking back at her was not small. She had large, dark eyes that held their ground, a mouth that people noticed before she spoke, shoulders that carried more than was visible. She was beautiful in a way that she had learned not to use as currency, because every place she had ever tried to spend it had cost her something she didn't intend to give. Dominic Caruso noticed her the way a man like him noticed everything, not with performance, not with overt attention, but with the quiet, total registration of someone who had trained himself to see. He was 41 years old, 6'4". The kind of body that did not happen accidentally, broad through the shoulders, thick through the chest and arms, every line of him suggesting not vanity, but discipline, the particular discipline of a man who kept himself strong because strength was a language he respected. His hands were large, his jaw was clean-shaved and set. Along his left forearm ran a tattoo that disappeared under his rolled sleeve, a pattern of something geometric and dark that Nadia had never been close enough to read. He was handsome, the way storms were handsome. You acknowledged it, and then you paid attention to what it could do. He had not spoken to her about anything beyond the professional for 11 months. She had answered his calls, coordinated his schedule, filtered the requests that came to his office door, and prepared his briefings with the kind of precision that earned her not compliments, but the continued absence of complaint, which, in Dominic Caruso's office, was the highest available form of praise. She did not know what he thought of her. She was not certain she wanted to. What she knew was this: she needed the job. She needed it in the specific, airless way that people need things, when the alternative is not merely inconvenience, but collapse. Her father, Marcus Voss, had borrowed heavily 5 years ago. Borrowed from the wrong people, through channels Nadia had not been aware of, in arrangements she had not signed but whose paperwork, when it surfaced, bore her name. Her name, written in her father's handwriting, beside lines she had never read. She had confronted him once. He had looked at her with the soft, practiced sorrow of a man who had long ago decided that his own survival was the only survival that required active protection. "I needed someone they'd believe in," he had said, as though that explained it, as though it were merely a technical problem she had failed to understand. Her brother Theo had known. That was the part she had never managed to fully absorb, that Theo who was 2 years older and who had been the person she called when things broke, had known and had said nothing because the scheme had been partially structured to run through his own debts before it funneled into the documents bearing her name. He had been protected by the very thing that put her at risk. He had watched her take the job at the Caruso Group, a job she had needed precisely because the financial pressure on her name had made ordinary employment complicated and ordinary credit unavailable. And he had never said a word. She had tried not to think too hard about what that meant. On the morning everything changed, Nadia arrived at 7:42 and found the floor unusually alive for the early hour. 2 men she recognized as part of Dominic's internal security were in the hallway near the financial review room. A third, someone she had never seen, stood near the elevator with his arms crossed and his eyes on the door. She sat at her desk, opened her system, and began her morning sequence. At 8:15, Dominic walked out of his office with a tablet in his hand and stopped at the edge of her desk. He was wearing a dark charcoal shirt, open at the collar, sleeves not yet rolled. He set the tablet face up in front of her without a word. On the screen was a spreadsheet, a segment of what appeared to be vendor payment records, with 3 columns highlighted in red. "These routing numbers," he said. His voice was low. It was always low. "Who authorized the standing transfer linked to your employee profile?" Nadia looked at the numbers. The room seemed to tilt very slightly. She knew those numbers, not because she had ever set them up, because she had seen them before years ago, in a document her brother had left open on a laptop she had accidentally touched when reaching past him at their father's kitchen table. She had not understood what she was looking at then. She understood it now. "Mr. Caruso," she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice came out. "I didn't authorize that." He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply watched her with those dark, still eyes that contained everything and revealed nothing, and Nadia felt the precise weight of being in a room with a man who had built an empire partly on his ability to know when someone was lying. She was not lying. She was also terrified, not of him exactly, but of what the truth was going to require her to say out loud in this room, to this man, after 11 months of saying almost nothing personal at all. "Then someone used your profile to route transfers," he said, "and that someone had access to your credentials, your onboarding records, and your direct deposit pathway." He paused. "Think carefully before you answer what I'm about to ask you." Nadia folded her hands on the desk. "Ask," she said. "Is there anyone in your personal life who knew you had taken this position? Who had access to your identification documents and who had a reason to move money without a name attached to it?" The question landed in the room between them. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was gray and rain-weighted. The lake somewhere beyond the skyline, invisible and cold. Nadia opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Yes," she said. And then, for the first time in 11 months, she told the truth to the most dangerous man she had ever worked for, and watched his face, which was always controlled, which was always composed, change. She did not tell him everything at once. It came out the way buried things come out, in pieces, under pressure, each piece dragging the next into the light before she could decide whether she was ready. She told him about the debt first, then about the documents with her name, then about her father's explanation, delivered in the kitchen of the house she had grown up in, with the particular gentleness of a man delivering a verdict he believed was reasonable. Then, finally, about Theo. Dominic did not interrupt her. He stood on the other side of her desk, with one hand resting flat on its surface and his eyes on her face, and he listened in the way that some people never learn to listen, with his entire attention, with nothing else competing for it. When she finished, the silence in the room had a different quality than the silence before she started. It was heavier. It was specific. "Your brother," he said, "Theodore Voss. He's been the point of contact for the Meridian vendor file. It wasn't a question. She could see from the way he said it that he already knew or had already suspected, and had been waiting to see whether her answer would confirm it or add something new. It added something new. The confirmation that she had not known, that she had been used without consent, without warning, by the two men who should have been the last people capable of doing it. That was the thing that shifted something behind his eyes. "Yes," she said, "I believe so." He straightened. He turned away from her and walked to the window, and she watched his reflection in the glass, the breadth of his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw, his right hand closing slowly into a fist at his side, and then releasing. She had seen him angry before, in the distant professional sense of being in a room adjacent to it. She had never seen it this close. It was not loud. That was the part that made it feel larger than a raised voice would have. The absolute, enforced quiet of a man containing something enormous. "How long have you known?" he asked without turning around. "About the debt with my name?" 5 years. She paused. "About Theo's involvement with yours?" "Since this morning." He turned back then. He looked at her for a long moment. "You came to work here because of the financial damage to your credit." "Yes." "And you stayed." "I needed to." Something moved through his expression that she couldn't read. Not pity. She would have recognized pity, and she would not have survived it in this room. It was something more complicated. Something that looked from the outside like a man rapidly recalculating something he had already assumed he understood. Nadia. It was the first time he had used only her first name. "You should have told me." She held his gaze. "You are the last person most people would choose to confess something like this to." "I know what I am," he said quietly. "That isn't what I'm talking about." She didn't respond immediately. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest, running in clean lines down the glass, and the city below was wet and grey and indifferent. She thought about what it meant that she was sitting here, having this conversation, in this office, with this man. She thought about the weight she had been carrying for 5 years, the quiet, daily weight of a name attached to a debt she hadn't made, the particular humiliation of being complicit in something by the mere fact of having been born into a family that found that compliance convenient. The worst part had never been the money. The worst part had been the understanding that she had been chosen precisely because she wouldn't cause trouble, that her composure, her competence, her silence had made her safe to exploit. She was done being safe to exploit. "I need to know something," she said. "What happens to Theo now?" Dominic crossed his arms. His expression did not soften exactly, but it recalibrated. "That depends on how this conversation goes. It depends on me. You're the one whose name is on the documents. You're the one with standing to press this in either direction. I'm not in the habit of making decisions about people's families without consulting the person those families damaged." She looked at him. "That is either a very generous policy or a very effective one." "It's both," he said, without a trace of irony. What she didn't know yet, what she would only piece together later in the days that followed, was that Theo had already made his own move. He had called Dominic's financial director that same morning, 20 minutes before the flagged spreadsheet had reached Dominic's tablet, claiming that Nadia had personally set up the routing structure, that she had used her position to facilitate a transfer he had brought to her attention as a favor to a family contact, and that he had documentation. He had bet that Dominic would act fast and ask questions later, that Nadia would be dismissed before she had the chance to say a word, and that the entire structure would be absorbed as an employee fraud case rather than traced back to its true origin. He had miscalculated the man. Dominic had received that call. He had listened to Theo's careful, pre-constructed version of events, and he had said nothing beyond that he would review the matter. Then he had walked out of his office and stood at Nadia's desk with a tablet, not to accuse her, to watch what she did when shown the truth. She had not flinched. She had not performed confusion or performed outrage. She had looked at the numbers, gone still, and told him the truth in the voice of someone who was finished protecting people who had never protected her. He had known, by the time she said her brother's name, that he had the picture. What he had not expected, what he had not budgeted for in the cold and efficient accounting of his attention, was the way she looked when she finally stopped speaking. Not relieved, not collapsed, still straight-spined, still composed, but with a particular fragility behind her eyes that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with cost. She had paid a price to sit here and say these words. She was still paying it. He walked back to her desk. He stopped close enough that she would have had to lean back slightly to look up at him, though she didn't. She looked up directly, with those dark eyes that held their ground. "Go home," he said. "Not permanently. Come back tomorrow." "And Theo?" "Theo," he said with a quiet that was worse than volume, "is going to learn what it costs to use my house, to settle a family debt." She stood up. She was not short, but standing next to him, she was aware of the difference in scale, the sheer physical mass of him, the way he occupied space not aggressively, but completely, the way a man that size simply displaced the air around him. "Mr. Caruso." "Dominic." She paused. "Dominic, I want you to know, I wasn't ignorant of what this company is. I wasn't naive about what I was walking into when I took this job. I made a calculation." "I know," he said. "So did I." She didn't ask what that meant. She picked up her bag and walked to the elevator, and the doors opened and closed, and she was gone. Dominic stood at the window for a long time after. Then he picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was brief and professional and ended with a single instruction delivered in a voice that brooked nothing. The second was to a number that rang 4 times before it was answered, and when it was answered, by the voice of a man who had spent the morning constructing an alibi made of half-truths, Dominic said only this: "Come to the building, now." And then he waited. Nadia did not go home. She went as far as the lobby, stood in the marble quiet of it for approximately 4 minutes, and then took the elevator back up, not to the 43rd floor, to the 42nd, which was a holding floor, conference rooms, secondary offices, the kind of anonymous space used for conversations that required a degree of remove from Dominic's primary operation. She sat in an empty conference room and looked at the rain against the glass and thought about what she was doing. She was not sure she knew. What she knew was that she could not sit in her apartment and wait to be told what had happened to her own life. She had done that for 5 years. She had been patient and composed and professionally excellent, and she had let the situation manage her because the situation involved people she had once trusted, and letting it manage her had felt like the least destructive available option. She understood now that it had been neither least destructive nor a real option. It had simply been a postponement. The destruction had been occurring the entire time, quietly and continuously, beneath the surface of her composure. She was done postponing. 40 minutes later, Theo arrived. She didn't see him come in. She heard him through the partial opening of the conference room door, his voice in the hallway carrying the particular tone she had known her entire life, the tone Theo used when he was performing confidence he did not feel, smooth, slightly too fast, structured around the assumption that he was the smartest person in the conversation. She heard Dominic's voice answer, a single sentence. She could not make out the words, only the register, low, flat, and carrying the particular weight of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. Then footsteps. The door 2 rooms down opened and closed. Nadia waited 15 minutes. Then she stood up, walked to the door at the end of the hall, knocked once, and opened it. Both men turned toward her. Theo's face did the thing she had always hated, the rapid cycling of expressions before settling on the one he calculated would be most effective. He landed on concern. "Nadia, what are you doing here? I thought you'd—" "I know what you told him this morning," she said. She had not planned to lead with this. She led with it anyway. "I know you called before the audit reached his desk. I know what you said." Theo's concern became something else briefly, and then corrected. "I was trying to protect you. You don't understand the full picture of what—" "Theo!" Her voice did not waver. "Stop." The room was quiet. Dominic stood to the side, one shoulder against the wall, arms crossed, watching them both. He said nothing. He was giving her the floor, she realized. Deliberately, consciously, because he had understood something about what this moment needed that she herself had only just understood. She needed to say it. Not for him, for herself. "You put my name on debt I didn't make," she said. "You watch me spend 5 years managing the consequences of it. You watch me take a job in a building I knew was dangerous to protect my own financial survival. And this morning, when you thought it was going to surface, you tried to make sure I took the fall instead of you." She paused. "I have spent a very long time wondering what I did wrong, what I missed, why the people who were supposed to be my family thought I was the appropriate person to sacrifice." She looked at him directly. "I didn't do anything wrong. You were just counting on me not to fight." Theo opened his mouth. "Don't," Dominic said. It was one word. It was enough. Theo looked at Dominic then, and whatever he saw there, the size of him, the absolute stillness, the particular quality of attention that preceded consequence, made him close his mouth. He was not a stupid man. He understood, looking at Dominic Caruso in that room, that the version of this situation he had planned for no longer existed. What was arranged after that, Nadia was not fully told, and she did not ask for every detail. She understood the shape of it. The financial routing would be traced, documented, and the exposure would attach to the person who had created it. Theo would have the opportunity to make it right by a method and timeline that were not hers to set. The documents bearing Nadia's name would be formally corrected through channels that Dominic had the reach to access. Her father would receive a conversation that she was not present for and did not need to be. It was not a perfect resolution. She was not a person who expected perfect resolutions. What it was real, a real and specific consequence, attached to real and specific people, which was more than she had received in 5 years of carrying it alone. She was standing at the window of the 42nd floor conference room when she heard the door open and knew without turning around that it was Dominic. She could feel the displacement of air behind her, the proximity of someone large and present and quiet. "You didn't go home," he said. "No, I noticed." She turned around. He was closer than she expected, though not in a way that was pressuring, just near, in the particular way of someone who had stopped performing distance they didn't feel. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me speak first." "It was yours to speak," he said simply. She looked at him. He looked at her. The rain was still going outside, steady and clean, and the city beyond the glass was lit in that particular way it got in the grey afternoon. Not beautiful exactly, but true. The kind of light that stripped things down to their actual shapes. There are moments that don't announce themselves as turning points. They arrive in ordinary rooms with ordinary rain outside, and they are recognizable only as what they are. A door standing open that you can choose to walk through or not. Nadia made her choice. "I'd like to stay in the position," she said, "if that's still an option." Something that might, on another face, have been called a smile moved briefly through his expression. "I never offered you leave." You said come back tomorrow. I did. He held her gaze. But that was before I understood what it cost you to still be here today. She was quiet for a moment. Does it change the offer? It changes what I'd like to offer, he said. But that can wait until tomorrow, when you've slept. She almost laughed. It was such a precise, deliberate, unexpected thing to say, practical and careful and entirely devoid of performance, that it landed differently than she was prepared for. All right, she said. She picked up her bag. She walked to the elevator. This time, he walked with her, not as an escort, not as a guard, but simply as a man who had decided to be present for a small thing as readily as he was present for large ones. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. He remained outside. "Dominic," she said, before the doors closed. He looked at her. "I would have told you," she said. "If I had known you would listen like that, I would have told you sooner." The doors closed between them. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was the most honest thing she had said to another person in 5 years, and it arrived in the lobby of a building that had once represented only a calculated risk, and now represented something considerably less reducible to calculation. In the weeks that followed, the documents were corrected. The financial structure collapsed back onto the person who had built it. Her brother called her twice. She answered the second time. The conversation was difficult and incomplete, and she did not pretend otherwise. But she had it, which was more than the woman she had been a month before would have allowed herself. And Dominic, true to the precision of everything he did, waited until she had been back at her desk for 10 days before he said anything beyond the professional. He said it at the end of an ordinary afternoon, in a low and careful voice, with the same quality of attention he gave everything that mattered to him. She said yes. Not because he was powerful, not because she was afraid, not because the alternative was worse, because she had spent 5 years being invisible to the people she trusted most, and the only man who had ever looked at her in a room full of evidence designed to discredit her and chosen to hear her out instead, was standing in front of her asking if she would let him know her. She was not a woman who confused rescue with love, but she was also, finally, a woman who no longer confused silence with safety. She said yes. And outside the 43rd floor windows, Chicago was cold and rain-clean and lit in the early evening dark, and the city went on the way cities do, indifferent to the small, permanent things that happen in ordinary rooms between people who choose, at last, to tell the truth. There is a kind of betrayal that doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the people who knew you would stay quiet, who counted on your composure, who used your name precisely because they trusted you wouldn't fight back. Nadia's lesson wasn't about the Mafia. It wasn't about the debt or the documents or even the man behind the desk. It was this: silence is not the same as safety, and the people who benefit most from your silence are rarely the ones who deserve your protection. She stopped carrying what was never hers to carry, and the moment she did, everything changed. If this story reached you, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done in her place, and tell me where in the world you're listening from.